Well, let's pray. Loving Lord God, we do ask that you would give us understanding of your word. As we read stories like this, sometimes they are baffling. Sometimes they are so different from our own culture, our own time. We don't know what to do with them. But your promise is that you speak to us. That you speak to us through stories both old and new. And we ask, Lord God, that you would, by your Spirit, add understanding to our reading. Amen. So what I really want to do with this passage is use it as a kickstarter, a jumping board for the whole of this Jacob story. Because what happens is that, as we heard in last week's reading, Jacob encounters God as he's crossing over a certain river. And he goes off to be with the distant relatives, with the family of his mother, and to stay with Laban, his uncle. And so he spends this time there, and he gets these two wives, and he amasses a huge herd, a flock, and possessions. And then he comes back to the promised land, a very changed man. And he has another significant encounter with God there. And that's the famous wrestling with God passage, where he changes his name, God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. Okay, now, so what we have in this, the faraway years, the lost years, if you want to call them something like that, it creates bookends around a very specific story. And the way the writers do this is by sort of layering brackets, so that what's in between the brackets, we're shown, is the crux of the whole thing, the real centre of this story. And that's what we're at. In the midst of the weirdness of this, and you read the same portion of it for us this morning. I really actually wanted to read the rest of it to you, because it's a pretty crazy story. The next 3 chapters I'll summarise. As you know, Jacob agrees to work 7 years basically as a dowry for Rachel. Well, the deceiver and the trickster of last week is now deceived and tricked himself. He's done in by Laban, who's more conniving than he is. And there's no other way to look at it. It's deception. Laban knows, everybody else knows, that there's this local custom that you don't marry off the younger one before the older one's married. And I think Shakespeare used that to good effect in some of his stories as well. But nonetheless, he knows about it, but never mentions it until the morning after he's deceived Jacob. And you can, you probably can't overestimate or overread that line when Jacob wakes up and says, in the morning, there was Leah. I'm sure there's a lot of use of veils and things like that make this all, and probably quite some wedding festival alcohol going on that make this all possible. But nonetheless, this is a deception, pure and simple, and Jacob is done. And Laban says, okay, well, you have to sort of see out this week, but then we'll have, that's the wedding week and celebrate, and then I'll give you the other daughter, and you work another 7 years. And he agrees. And there is something here of this wonderful love that we don't see very often through the Old Testament, but he genuinely loves Rachel and will do anything to be with her. And that's wonderful. Where we finish up that little passage is this ominous line. He marries Leah and then he marries Rachel, but he loved Rachel more. And there's this dun 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 that leads us into the next few chapters, because we know this is a bad situation. We know that this whole thing, this whole deception, sets up a family full of conflict. Just like so many of our families, there's always, no matter how lovely it starts out, there's always some conflict here, there, or, and it's often Uncle Laban that causes it. But no, it won't. Probably he's having too many wives. I think that's... No. It's completely unrelated to all of those things. Families in and of themselves can just have conflict. But we know that it's always going to get bad if it starts out with something like, but he loved this one more. And don't we hear echoes of that through so many of these stories of the families of faith? There are all these children, but he loved this one more. Or this one was the favourite one. Families and conflict. But what we see is God working in the midst of that. God doesn't abandon this family. This is the chosen family. But does he say, oh, you guys are a mob of thieves and tricksters and, no. God continues to work gently and gracefully and through these people. And we're told, even in this early section, that Laban, when he sneaks Leah into the picture, he's not just, being abusive to Jacob. This is seriously abusive of Leah. Sometimes we, as men, might read over that. Just how disrespectful that is to Leah. Does she agree to this? We're not really told. He just does it sneakily. And I suspect not. But anyhow, he also gives her Zilpah as the maidservant. And then, when he marries off Rachel, he gives Rachel Bilhah. And you think, well, why do we care about the names of these maidservants? Well, you see, what happens is that after a while, Leah has these children. First she has a child and says something along the lines of, surely now my husband will love me. Nope, doesn't quite work. So she has another child, and surely now my husband will respect me. Nope. Third child, surely now he will honour me. She's gone from hoping for love down to honour, but no, still not enough. And all this time as she's having children, she's rubbing Rachel's nose in it. And Rachel is barren and is not having any children. And so then what happens is, basically, I hope I don't get it too out of order. You'll have to read it, these few chapters and check up on me after. That's your homework. But then basically what happens is Rachel says, okay, well, maybe if I give Jacob my maidservant, Bilhah, that she will then have children for me. And so she has some children, and she thinks, ha, now I'm vindicated, I'll call my son Vindication, or something along that line. So all the children are given these names, attributing to how God is working in them and how God is in fact answering these different cries, or their hopes of the love that might come through these children. Anyhow, they all have these weird names. And so then Bilhah starts popping out children. So then Leah gets jealous that now Rachel is, amassing some children. So she says, oh, well, maybe I'll give Jacob Zilpah, my maidservant. And so she starts popping out children. And then Rachel goes, oh, well, that's no good, and finds that one of Leah's first children is playing down in the river and finds these mandrakes. Now, of course, we all know mandrakes. Not. They were used in that mushroom soup, I suspect. They're down in the fungus class of plants. Anyhow, they're supposed to be this aphrodisiac, but somehow in this story it's used as if, well, if I could have some of these mandrakes that your son has picked and found, maybe I will fall pregnant. This is what Rachel is saying. And so she bargains with Leah, if you give me some of your son's mandrakes, I'll let you sleep with Jacob again. And she goes, oh, all right. So she pops out a few more children. You know, she's got 5 now. And after all of this, like, it really is a comical little scene. It's supposed to be entertaining. It really is. And so then what happens is finally, after all these boys, there's one girl to Leah and to both the different maidservants, Rachel has a boy, Joseph. He's the child that they've been waiting for, that God has been waiting for, really. After all their attempts to try and make this stuff happen, to make the promises fulfilled through all their own efforts, they come to children, for sure, but to not fulfillment. Even Leah, you know, desperately trying to get acceptance and love from her husband, it just doesn't work, no matter how many children she has. But then Joseph comes along. We're told that after all of this, after all of the intervention of, you know, Leah and maidservant and, you know, Zilpah and Bilhah, and even using aphrodisiacs and everything we could find, God hears Rachel's cry. God remembers Rachel, and God opens her womb. And Joseph comes along. And as soon as that happens, Jacob says, now it's time for us to go back to the land that God has promised. Now it's time for us to start moving. But this sets up this whole new phase where he says to Laban, well, I think it's probably time for me to move along, but I've been working all these years for you, and so I've got nothing. And Laban says, well, tell me what your wages are, just like from the start. He says, you know, what should I pay you? And he says, well, how about with the flocks, you know, you're amassing. Since I've come, you had very little. Now you've got these huge flocks. How about I work for you for the spotted and the speckled and the striped ones? You know, the lamb and the goats. And I don't know if they're talking about camels, but later on he has camels as well. And Laban says, yes, all right, you take all the spotted and the speckled and the striped ones, and I'll have the clean and white ones. That way, when we know, you know, when we come to separate the flocks, it'll be very clear whose is whose. And so he said, well, why don't you do it? Great idea. We'll start that in the morning. Straight away, he turns to Leah and Rachel's brothers and says, quick, grab all the black ones, the spotted ones, the speckled ones, and take them off to your farm, you know, kilometres up into the north, so that there will be no spotted and speckled and striped ones and to breed in the flock. So he's trying to do him in again. But then what we see this time is that God somehow works through this crazy, superstitious idea that Jacob says, right, well, when the flock, the sheep and the goats come down to drink, I'm going to place different coloured sticks in the trough. And that will somehow mesmerise them, and when they go to mate after they've drank, they will produce spotted and speckled and striped sticks. But when the weakly ones come, I'll take the sticks away, and they'll just have normal plain ones. You know, it's this wonderfully entertaining story of how God is now starting to work through these weird and wonderful ideas, but is determined to bless Jacob. And as the flocks and the herds increase for both Jacob and for Laban, God is at work to bless them. And again, we see this despite their efforts, you know, to try and out-trick one another and to try and secure something for their future. God's purpose, God's plan is going to happen. God's will is going to come to fruition and to fulfillment. And at best, all they're doing is, you know, getting in the way, maybe stalling things a little. So in the midst of this family conflict, All of them know that there is a future coming, and it somewhat frightens them. They struggle with it. They're not really ready for it. They're in a position where they kind of crave the future to come, but they also dread what it might be, and so they're trying desperately to work through it. What we see happening is, again, more of this crazy story where secretively Jacob jumps up and he says to the girls, his wives, says, we're going to leave in the dead of night in a hurry. And you can hear little echoes of the Exodus story very much through this. It says we're going to gather up all our things and take off in the middle of the night and be far away before Laban even knows we're gone. And that's what they do. The girls basically say, yeah, he has been abusive to us. He's been abusive to us, using us as basically pawns to amass his own wealth, using us as a bribe to get you to work for him so that he could amass this great wealth. And what has he given to us? Nothing. And they basically say, well, we're with you because he's treated us like slaves, like dirt. And there's this strange story where Rachel, unbeknownst to Jacob, decides she's going to steal Laban's household gods, figurines of some description. And so she steals them and hides them in the saddlebags, and off they trot. Well, Laban's furious. He comes charging after them, just like the Egyptians, charging after them with all his family, all the boys and all the arms he can get. And they catch up 3 days down the track, and he comes to Jacob and says, what have you done? You've stolen my daughters. Oh, my daughters. Not that he really cared, but the basic thing is that while Jacob was working for him, while Jacob was the shepherd, there was this massive increase in his flock. And he doesn't want to lose that. So he chases him down and tries to tell him to come back. But Jacob says no. And he says, well, and by the way, somebody's stolen my family gods. That's a criminal offence. And Jacob says, hey, none of us. You can kill whoever, you can find the family gods with. Because he doesn't know that Rachel's stolen them, the one that he loves. And there's this massive tension. You think, holy cow, what has he said? This is going to turn very ugly very quickly. And the best I can explain it is that this funny little triumph of Rachel, who was the beautiful and loved, but treated like dirt by her father, gets one over on her father because he searches all the tents, can't find his family gods anywhere. And he comes to where Rachel is, and she says, oh, sorry, I can't get up, it's that time of the month, so I'm just sitting here casually on the saddlebags. Otherwise I'd love to get up for you. And he says, oh, well, I can't find them anywhere. Damn, I must have been wrong. And off he goes. And that's it. No sort of end to the story, apart from the fact that she finally gets a little win over her dad. And there's certain, cultural offences to his family gods. But there's also this push now to the girls very much attributing all of this working to Yahweh, to the God of Isaac and Jacob. But you remember last week's story. I know you do. Even after this wonderful, colourful passage, God made a promise to Jacob that he would bring him back to this land, but only when he had amassed this wonderful stack of heirs and prosperity. And not just prosperity for himself, but he would be a blessing to others. And when you look at this crazy story, what you see is he's starting this march back into the promised land. And he's got 11 kids. He's got 2 wives. He's got these maidservants. He's got other servants. He's got these huge flocks of all the best, strongest sheep and goats and all the rest. And not only that, but the whole household of his family have got amassed, their flocks and their riches and everybody. And while they're parting, more or less on a truce, and these guys become, one of the favourite sparring partners of the Israelites in the centuries to come. They're the family who God has begun to bless through Jacob, nonetheless. Though all of their inventiveness comes to no use, all of the ways they try and work out this future for themselves, all they're really doing is stalling and getting in the way. God still works through them. God still works through these people to bless them and to bring his promises to fulfillment. There was this wonderful line in the movie last night where the old lady is talking to this younger lady that she's teaching about prayer, teaching how to pray. And she says, you have to fight for what's important, and you do your fighting in prayer. And she says, part of that process is to leave it all to God. Give it all to God, and then you just get out of the way and let him do his work. Despite all of Jacob's crazy story, and Rachel's too, and all the others jumping in, what we see is when God remembers and hears their cries, then God steps in and does his work. And in so many ways, this crazy story is a reminder for us that for our future to be God's future, we give it to him. We call on his name, and then we get out of the way. And we allow him to work his promise and his purpose through us. Because it's in God. He's our only source of hope. Not in us. Not in the maidservants. Not in the mandrakes. Not in all the crazy schemes we might have. God is our source of hope. In his faithfulness we trust. So let's sing our final song, Trust in You. And it speaks wonderfully of these different ways where in the stories of old, people cried out to God and he did miraculous things. But this girl is saying as she writes this song, even when I don't see that happening, when I don't see you moving the mountains and parting the waters, I'm going to trust in you. I will trust in you. Let's stand together.